Hello and welcome to another episode of EnVisioneering Exchange, the podcast where industry leaders discuss the most important topics in sustainability, climate change, buildings, and urban efficiency. I'm Vic Marinich from Danfoss, and I'm delighted to be the host of this podcast. You can subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Captivate, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we have Anthony McCray, Director of Business Development for Data Centers at Danfoss, here to share his thoughts on the trends facing the data industry and the outlook on data center sustainability over the next 5 years. Anthony, thanks for taking time to join the show.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
So maybe before we kick off into the details, can you give us a bit of a background on how you got yourself into the data center world in the first place?
Yeah, that's an interesting road. It probably starts out in the U.S. military. I was playing college basketball and got hurt. And my dad was in the Air Force, and he was like, well, you need to join the military. And I was like, I don't want to join the military. So I ended up looking into the U.S. Navy and noticed that they had an advanced electronics program. And so I ended up joining, did a 6-year commitment, and I was responsible for their surface search radar systems, air search radar systems, in addition to their satellite navigation systems. And so that put me in the thrust of the high-tech space. So once I got out, I went to a recruiter. Recruiter said, hey, you have a background that looks very aligned with the company, which I can't tell you what they do because they're partially governmental. And that turned out to be Qualcomm. So I was employee at 1100 at a company called Qualcomm, which is very prominent in the wireless and data center chipset company from an infrastructure company. And over the last probably the following 15 years, I was an RF engineer, went back to school, finished up school. And then that led to really in the wireless telecom ecosystem, in which we went through, as you recall, 3G, 4G, the different data wireless formats. And then we hit 5G. And 5G, for a lot of people don't know, is the first what they call cloud native technology. And cloud meaning digital transformation. And so that was my segue into data centers, because most of that compute, storage, and networking resides on a data center versus being on a conventional wireless infrastructure switch and sort. So that was my evolution into that. And so I was recruited by Amazon Web Services for a senior business development technical role. And I was with Amazon for 3 years, building out outpost colocation data centers across the Americas, in addition to running about 1/3 of their labs on the West Coast for doing a lot of their AI and compute storage inferencing that occurs on the server racks. And so I spent 3 years basically doing that. And then out of the blue, I got this growth focus on wanting to hone in more focused on different subsystems of the data center, what actually grows into that. And Danfoss was a focus area of mine because I saw that they were from Europe, and I have an affluent attraction to companies over there, how they think, their thought process from an environmental friendly perspective. And so I joined Danfoss, and with the focus on our cooling infrastructure in addition to our electrification power conversion infrastructure. And it's been a wonderful ride so far.
Fantastic. And now I have to remember to ask you about your March Madness picks after we're done here.
Okay.
Or maybe we save that for the next podcast.
Yeah.
So if now we jump back to data centers for a minute, it's all the talk for sure in our industry, and I mean we see across the news, and the demand for storage and processing is just growing right through the roof. Can you maybe help us understand why is it happening now, and what are the implications for the industry?
That's a great question, Vic. Yeah. And so let me take off my Danfoss thinking cap and put on my AWS thinking cap and Verizon thinking cap from those days. And I'll answer this because that's more of a digital transformation frame of thought. So the really basis to the answer to that question is really close to home. I'll give you an analogy. At my house, typically on an afternoon after dinner, my 12-year-old, my 18-year-old conventionally are probably utilizing 4 devices each on the internet. And so that comes in the form of processing data in the cloud. The bulk of that really resides within a data center, either a hyperscale data center or a colocation or an enterprise data center. So then when you go ahead and add to the mix AI, what's happening with machine learning and what the data scientists are continuing to evolve with large language model inferencing on those servers in the form of compute on a data center, And then we can go on deeper, and you think of the silicon that actually resides on those servers in the form of the CPUs and GPU roadmap. And there's really your answer with regards to data demand, why it's continued to increase, because we continue to evolve and expand and innovate.
Yeah, I'm on the mechanical and cooling side of things, so I'm naive to a lot of the actual data storage stuff. So I did a little bit of investigating ahead of time. And so a Google AI search, I'm seeing, takes about 3 watt hours of energy, and we do 2 trillion searches a year, right? So 6 trillion watt hours of electricity just to do something that we all do kind of even without thinking, right? On our phone, on our computer, or whatever else, right? And that's, you have to equate that back to either cars or houses, right? So that powers about 500,000 homes, right? If we're doing something that we probably do a dozen times a day without even right thinking about it. So that's a huge amount of energy that goes into all this storage and processing. And so that it's one thing to have the storage and the processing, right? But then how do you see the implications of this data center growth for our energy infrastructure, right? And what are the data center providers doing to help respond to those needs?
That's actually a really great questions because the data center providers are at somewhat of a crossroads from that perspective. Today, for example, probably 3 to 4% of the electrical demand that data centers utilize is probably going to grow, projected probably around 11% by 2030. So the issue is that data centers, number one, they're very clustered in a specific geographic area. So data center providers are really, at this point in time, running into a lot of concerns because them being clustered, there's limited power right now. So at this point in time, geographically, they're seeking what's called procuring for alternative power right now. You're seeing that in announcements and things in the form of nuclear microgrids, also renewable energy, which is a good thing, such as solar, wind, hydroelectric applications as well. And I think another form is actually green hydrogen, which is one that's dear to me because it's actually something where Danfoss is actively participating in pilots, some of the initial pilots for actually doing power conversion for infrastructure to support fuel cells, both on the grid for UPS backup systems and actually fully microgridded off for full electrification. And so we're seeing a lot of that happening right now. And there's also, the government has been involved with, from a kickback perspective, in providing PPAs, energy certifications. And you'll see that with the larger hyperscalers that are occurring right now. So,
Yeah, I even remember. So I'm in the Baltimore area, and there was a story, I think late last year, about I don't remember which, but one of the big hyperscalers looking to acquire 3 Mile Island,
yes.
right? Where those of us in the general Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey area remember 3 Mile Island quite well. So very interesting that people are right looking that far into just into trying to get energy for these data centers.
That's a wonderful perspective that you brought up, and that was Microsoft, by the way, and they're actually partnered up with Dominion Energy for that. And to your point, that's exactly what we're seeing right now with this alternative power procurement. And when I saw that announcement with 3 Mile Island, that was quite interesting and an eye opener.
Yeah, it has definitely evoked certain emotions to those of us old enough and in the region, right? When you talk 3 Mile Island. So if we get back to what the data center guys are doing, I know Amazon Web Services, right? They just announced their new data center components initiative. Can you maybe speak a bit to what are the key elements of that initiative and how that's going to influence the industry going forward?
Yeah, that's an interesting because that was something that was very recent. It was late Q4 when I first heard about this, and I'm very focused on the AWS hyperscale account there. What they're actually doing is AWS is going and they're taking an in-depth scope of all their infrastructure, and they're looking for flexible components that can generate an additional 12% of compute power is what's really behind this. And it's in support of AI, so the machine learning and the large language modeling. But they want to also do it to maintain continued improvement on their uptime, which is their number one priority, in addition to energy efficiency. So AWS is actually looking at all subsystems of the data centers, including the gray space, the power distribution. So everything with regards to where Danfoss plays, the coolers, the cracks, the craws, the cooling towers, all of that, to look for this additional 12% of compute power in the form of energy efficiency, in addition to all the way into the white space to the interfacing CDU and into the in-rack components that are supporting liquid cooling in support of AI, all the way to the cold plate, to those CPU and GPUs that NVIDIA are actually continue to evolve with their roadmaps.
So they're using existing components. They're just trying to find that sixth or seventh or eighth gear to squeeze a little bit more out of it, huh?
That, and along with any innovation, and that's what's exciting about what we do at Danfoss, is we're great with innovation. They're also sitting down and they want to listen to innovation. So it might be a product like a PIC valve, ABQM in our hydronics area, that might be, maybe the form factor isn't right, but they're willing to sit down and talk with us about maybe evolving and developing a byproduct of that to work with them to achieve this 12% compute power that they're trying to achieve.
Getting a bit away from the energy around computing itself, right? Over the past couple of years, it's been a big focus everywhere, but data centers obviously more so under the microscope to improve energy efficiency and reduce carbon emissions. It's something near and dear to Danfoss's heart as well. We've seen a lot of developments of new data center cooling technologies. So can you talk a bit about the methods that we're seeing today and what developments or regulations are coming on the horizon?
Yeah, so what I'll try to do is, Danfoss, of course, I mean, we're experts in the particular area of air and water cooling innovation. There's no secret about that. We're broad and we're one of the best in class leaders on a global basis. But two that come to mind as a direct result of the data demand of a prior question, the first of which I would say would be immersion cooling. And so immersion cooling is quite unique. It's in which you take the entire IT infrastructure and you actually submerge all the IT server components into a non-conductive liquid to dissipate the heat. It's one of the most highly efficient and effective methods to doing that. The only issue with immersion cooling is it's quite expensive and a little complex to deploy. So with that, the second one that I'll mention that is much more commonplace would be direct-to-chip cooling, liquid cooling, in which the cooling is actually distributed from a CDU into the rack, in-rack, and then also directly into the key components, into a cold plate that's a copper cold plate that actually is integrated on top of the CPU and the GPU at that cold plate. And it's extremely efficient, less expensive than immersion cooling. Those are two of the really key catalysts that we're seeing advancements in today.
And just maybe to be clear for everybody, CDU, then we're talking a cooling distribution unit, right? So we have basically a chiller, right, or some form of mechanical cooling on one side of that unit, and then the other side of the unit there in the white space distributing the fluid that's going to direct to those chips for cooling, right?
That's exactly right, Vic. And so that, again, yeah, moving out from the gray space, from the chiller, moving into what's called the TCS loop, you're exactly right, that non-conductive fluid in the CDU, you're right. And that's actually controlling everything from the pressure, the flow, and it has a controller, of course, intelligence within that. And it's comprised of about 75% of the Danfoss components that we actually innovate and manufacture.
Yeah, and just trying to get all the alphabet soup, make sure, yeah, we got the CDUs. Okay. So we still have to worry about, right, we're still doing mechanical cooling to get these chips down to the temperature that they need to operate efficiently. How is the data center industry managing the refrigerant transition, and how do we see that impacting future cooling methods? You know, for residential and commercial buildings, I think we've kind of gone through the whole process, the move to the next gen refrigerant, but I think data centers probably have some more unique requirements, right, than what you would have just in your household or in a commercial space. So how are they managing that transition?
That's a great question. And the way I probably would best respond to that would be, I would probably want to break down this from a geographic perspective. And where Danfoss plays and has innovation in history, in Europe, for example, I would say that they're probably 20, 30 years ahead of the US and North America with regards to being environmental friendly and focused on zero carbon emissions. And with the forefront of that being some of the Nordic countries, Northern Europe, and definitely Germany being probably the most stringent in Europe with regards to refrigerants, particularly those that are low GWP and PFASs with the focus area there. And then what I'll do is shift back over to North America in the U.S. Some of that is actually the jury's out because the new administration, I think the jury's still out on what type of direction the new administration is actually going to go with regards to supporting some of the mandates that had been in place with the previous administration with regards to our net zero decarbonization targets. So I think that we'll maintain that. So here in the U.S., ironically, we sat down with NVIDIA probably 3 months ago on this very question to get guidance. And what we saw is that probably the U.S. is probably, if you were to look onto a project management sheet, U.S. is probably a good 5 years behind with regards to how stringent we're going to be with regards to GPAs, PFSs, and things of that nature. With some focuses are going away from 1, 2, 3 to things such as 1, 2, 3, 4 ZE refrigerants of that nature. We are making movements in that particular direction, just probably not as extreme as they are in Europe.
It sounds like you're finding the same battles, right, as everywhere, right? Everybody wants a zero GWP, zero PFAS, A1, right, non-flammable, non-toxic refrigerant, and I don't know that anybody's found that yet. So it's truly a matter of trade-offs versus, right, just somebody engineering that right solution, right? So, but I guess things like that are going very well in Europe, like R290, we probably don't want to consider in data centers, right? I imagine highly explosive gases near data centers don't go well hand in hand, right?
Oh, you're point on there.
Yeah. So, and I guess that's one question you can't just Google and get the right answer to, right? What's the perfect refrigerant? So
I concur.
Yeah. So it seems like, okay, similar challenges. And I've done the same on the air conditioning side in general. Been talking to a lot of customers since the AHR show some weeks ago, and the picture gets super fuzzy after like 2034, right? Or something like that. So, yeah. But we do have mechanical cooling systems today. And of course, they all generate heat. And one thing I think you mentioned our efforts in Europe, I think something Europe does very well or is getting much better at is reusing that heat, right? Having heat reclaim or heat reuse. And that really offers some good energy savings, right? Because now you don't have to use energy to generate heat. You just take the waste heat from a data center, right, and can use it to help warm whatever homes, factories, processes, whatever it is, right? So there really is some great potential in heat recovery to reduce emissions. But here in the U.S. and North America, it's been quite challenging to implement. Can you maybe talk a bit about what kind of infrastructure you think is needed and maybe how industry can overcome some of these challenges so we can take better advantage of heat reclaim and heat reuse?
And as you just attested to, it's really due in part to Europe being environmentally focused and having been environmentally focused for years, right? Their infrastructure in particular, when you look at their district energy, they've been built to define entire communities, while in the U.S., that just isn't the case, right? So in the U.S., it's primarily, we're seeing heat reuse probably more prominently in the agriculture industry. That's probably best positioned use case for heat reuse. So it's probably really more, I would say, a case-by-case opportunity that you'll have with an ideal characteristic to provide a heat reuse application in probably sort of a medical campus type environment, an educational campus type environment, or maybe a residential high-rise, because there's proximity limitations with regards to where you deploy a data center and be able to provide that input along with that temperature that needs to be the proper input on defining whether you need a heat pump to support that or not. But certainly it's an exciting area, and it's an area myself personally, I think that there's probably a focus area in the North America that's probably along the Canadian border that probably is one of the more ideal areas to probably focus on heat reuse. And once again, it's going to be case by case just because our infrastructure just isn't set up that way to support it.
Yeah, and I think we're quite a bit more spread out than they are in Europe, right? So we don't quite have the big mass of people that everywhere to go in one place. And I think we're a much more cooling focused country. I did many district cooling projects, and the district cooling could justify any capex. And heating then was kind of okay. Once the streets are open, we'll put in some extra pipes for heating, right? That was like an afterthought. Whereas in Europe, I think it's the opposite, right? They're very focused on heating. So they're having these big district heating networks, and then cooling becomes the afterthought. So, like you said, right, we can maybe move way up north, look at district heating, but we've got a lot of stuff south of that where it could be challenging. But yeah, I think universities, hospitals, industrial applications who need heat, and if we're located nearby, it's kind of a no-brainer. Just have to. I'm sure there's regulations and other stuff, right, that we have to overcome with all that, right? So maybe now a bit off the technical side, when you have a boom like this with data centers, it means lots and lots of data centers are going up, right? And you have a lot of the, we'll call it the NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard efforts coming about now. So maybe kind of look at it from the, that social or political side, right? Why is community engagement so important now with the industry, right? And how can the data center operators improve their relationships with the surrounding communities and address some of the issues that they have?
I think number one, it comes down to building trust. There's no doubt about it, because I think there's a lot of miseducation, misunderstanding about data centers, and sometimes it gets a bad name. And I think it's so important that, and this is not something I'm coming up with, it's something pretty well known. If you go into iMasons and various environmental groups and policy groups, that we need to better educate the local communities on the benefits, number one. And most of it is really reminding the communities of how data centers play a role in their day-to-day lives. I think that's one of the most important, when you remind the community and individuals about how data centers really play in our day-to-day lives. Earlier, we were talking, and I was talking about after dinner at my house, conventionally, my 12-year-old, my 18-year-old, they're probably on 4 devices, 8 combined. And I can tell you, if I pull the plug on the internet, they're in the hallway. I didn't see them. I don't know where they were at. They're in the hallway looking around. Dad, what happened to the internet? The other thing is to actually educate the community on the employment opportunities that data centers bring to the community, in addition to some of the tax relief components of deploying a data center in the communities as well. So there's a lot of ways I think we can communicate and better work closely with the community to offset some of the fears and concerns there.
Yeah. The energy consumption, right? Water consumption, I guess those things, right, obviously are going to be concerned, right? But it's not a steel mill that you're looking to bring in. It's not a landfill we're looking to, that they'd be looking to bring in that would really have an impact. And I'm trying to think where I was in the Northern Virginia area, which is kind of data center central, right? And walking around and pointed out a data center. And I remember somebody thinking, yeah, that's a data center, right? Because it looks like, just your regular old office building or warehouse or whatever, right? If you walk past, whatever steel mill or manufacturing, you're walking past a factory, right? These are really integrated already into much of the town. So yeah, maybe the education on the benefits of, would go a long way. I guess finally, the last question, anything we forgot to ask, any comments you want to make here before we wrap things up on around the data center?
One that I'll add pertaining to not just educating the community, but it's also educating them probably on some of the cooling techniques that we do employ in the masses, such as free cooling. That's a mechanism by which you're reducing water usage, so WE, at the same time trying to maintain PUE efficiencies to satisfy the hyperscalers and colocation providers. But we are implementing technologies to sustain our water usage, keep that in check. I will mention that, though. And I think bringing some of that education about the actual data center infrastructure and different cooling techniques, what we're doing to actually assist the community and the population at mass, is another thing that I would like to add to that with regards to educating the community.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think a lot of the developments that are being driven by the data center industry around efficiency, right? If we can apply those same things to commercial buildings, residential houses, and that kind of stuff, and everybody gets the benefit of this improvement in efficiency, right? It'll kind of drive down energy consumption costs and everything for everybody, right? So they're kind of leading the way to some of this innovation in general on the cooling side also, right?
That's actually an excellent point. Absolutely.
Fantastic. So that's it for this episode of EnVisioneering Exchange. And I'd like to thank my guest, Anthony McCray from Danfoss, for joining us.
Thank you. And I really was delighted to be here and looking forward to the future.
Don't forget to subscribe to EnVisioneering Exchange on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Captivate, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review, and share it with your network. Thanks for listening, and talk to you next time.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the EnVisioneering Exchange podcast series are solely those of the individuals involved and not necessarily represent those of Danfoss LLC and its employees. Danfoss LLC is not responsible and does not verify for accuracy any of the information contained in the podcast series available for listening on this site. This podcast series does not constitute professional advice or services. This podcast, including Danfoss LLC and the producers, disclaim responsibility from any possible adverse effects of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and Danfoss LLC in this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility of statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about the guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast. The developers of the EnVisioneering Exchange podcast site assume no liability for any activities in connection with this podcast or for use of this podcast in connection with any other website, computer, or playing device.